Have you ever wondered where did Cain get his wife? It's one of the Bible's oldest mysteries. In Genesis, we read about Adam and Eve, their sons Cain and Abel, and then suddenly, Cain has a wife. But the Bible never names her. So, who was she? Where did she come from? And what deeper truth does her presence reveal? In today's video, we're going to unravel the ancient mystery behind Cain's mysterious wife, the woman the Bible never named, but whose existence opens up profound truths about humanity, sin, and God's unfolding plan. Stay with us till the end. You're about to discover something most people miss when they read the book of Genesis. The account of Cain's wife in the Bible has long puzzled readers, leading many to question how she could have existed if Adam and Eve were the only humans created at the beginning. Genesis 4:17 tells us that Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. The verse seems straightforward, but the mystery lies in the fact that up to that point, only Adam, Eve, Cain, and the slain Abel are explicitly mentioned in Scripture. This has led to a significant question. Where did Cain's wife come from? To understand this, we must look deeper into what the Bible tells us and how ancient historical context helps us interpret what might at first seem like a contradiction. The Bible often records key figures and events, while leaving out less central details. The early chapters of Genesis especially are more concerned with communicating theological truths and major events in the formation of the world and humanity, rather than giving an exhaustive genealogy or listing every individual. Genesis 5:4 gives us an important insight into the population of the early world. It states that Adam lived 800 years after the birth of Seth and had sons and daughters. This verse confirms that Adam and Eve had many children beyond Cain, Abel, and Seth. The Bible does not give the names of these other children, likely because they were not central to the unfolding redemptive narrative. Therefore, it is entirely plausible that Cain's wife was his sister, or perhaps a niece, one of the many offspring of Adam and Eve. In ancient times, the practice of marrying a sibling or close relative would not have carried the same implications it does today. At the beginning of human history, the genetic material within the human race was uncorrupted by mutations that accumulate over generations. Adam and Eve were created directly by God, perfect and without flaw. As such, their children would have inherited a pure genetic code. Modern science confirms that close relative marriages are genetically risky because of the increased likelihood of passing on recessive traits. and mutations, 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 and mutations. But such issues would not have existed in the first generations of human history. It wasn't until many generations later, when the human gene pool had degraded, that God gave Israel the Mosaic Law, which included specific prohibitions against marrying close relatives. These laws, found in Leviticus 18, were given for both moral and practical reasons, including the preservation of health and the structure of the community. So in the early years of mankind, marriages between siblings or close relatives were necessary and permissible. The command given to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1:28, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, was a divine directive that had to be fulfilled with the family that God had originally created. Cain, after killing his brother Abel, was driven out by God and sent to live as a wanderer. However, even in his punishment, God protected Cain by placing a mark upon him so that others would not kill him. This act shows that there were indeed others who might have posed a threat to Cain, which supports the idea that many other descendants of Adam and Eve were already in existence by that time. It is important to understand that Cain's story is not meant to be a full demographic report of the early human population. Rather, it is a theological narrative that illustrates the consequences of sin, the justice and mercy of God, and the ongoing unfolding of human history. The fact that Cain had a wife is not a contradiction, but a natural consequence of Adam and Eve having many children. If they were the first humans and their children married among themselves, then the presence of Cain's wife becomes not only understandable but necessary. She is unnamed, not because she was unimportant, but because her role in the narrative did not require further elaboration. The ancient style of writing in the Bible often highlights only the main characters and events to keep the focus on the broader theological story. There is no need for every individual to be named in order for their existence to be acknowledged. It is also significant to note that genealogical records in the Bible often skip over daughters and lesser-known sons. The line of descent and the focus of the narrative are often traced through certain individuals who were crucial to the development of God's covenantal plan. The silence about Cain's wife is not a flaw, but a reflection of the literary style and theological emphasis of Genesis. Many people who criticize the Bible for this supposed gap do so from a modern lens, expecting ancient texts to provide the same type of detailed data we find in contemporary history books. But the ancient Hebrew writers were more concerned with meaning, moral lessons, and divine revelation than with exhaustive detail. This doesn't mean the Bible is inaccurate. It means it was written with a different purpose and perspective. The truth is, Cain's wife did exist, and she was part of the extended family of Adam and Eve. Her presence is a testimony to the early multiplication of humanity, as commanded by God. She also represents the many unnamed people who played crucial roles in the spread of civilization, yet who remain in the background of biblical history. These individuals were real, important, and remembered by God, even if not recorded by name in the text. In addition to all of this, the fact that Cain's wife existed highlights the resilience of life after the fall. Though sin had entered the world through Adam and death, through Cain's murder of Abel, life still moved forward. Families were formed, children were born, and cities were built. Cain's wife helped him raise a family and founded a lineage that included Enoch, a builder of cities. Her role, though not detailed, is essential to the unfolding human story. In conclusion, the mystery of Cain's wife is not a contradiction in the Bible, but a reflection of our limited understanding when we read ancient texts with modern expectations. The truth is found in the scriptures themselves. Adam and Eve had many children, and from those early generations came the families that began to populate the earth. Cain's wife was one of those children, a sister or niece, whose presence was both natural and necessary. Her story, though unnamed, is part of God's greater plan, a plan that included the survival and spread of humanity, even in the face of sin and brokenness. Understanding why God allowed close relative marriages, like that of Cain and his wife, in the earliest stages of human history requires us to look at both the biological and theological contexts provided by Scripture. At first glance, the idea of Cain marrying his sister or close relative may seem uncomfortable or morally questionable by modern standards. However, we must remember that the moral laws and biological concerns that exist today were not the same in the beginning. In the earliest period of human life, the world was different. Humanity was new, the earth was unmarred by generations of sin and decay, and the genetic material passed down from Adam and Eve was still uncorrupted. According to the Bible, Adam and Eve were created directly by God. They were formed in perfection, without flaw or disease. This means that their children would have inherited a genetically pure DNA, free from the mutations and defects that accumulate over time in the human gene pool. As a result, marriages between siblings or close relatives in those early generations would not have posed the same genetic risks they do today. This is important because it explains why God did not initially forbid such unions. In fact, he allowed and even necessitated them so that humanity could fulfill his command to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. The command found in Genesis 1:28 was not symbolic. It was practical and literal. Adam and Eve, being the first humans, were responsible for populating the earth. There were no other families, no other tribes, and no alternative communities. If their children had not married one another, humanity would have come to a halt. Thus, these close relative marriages were not only permitted but required in order for the human race to continue. This allowance was a temporary provision made during a unique period in human history. As the population grew and the genetic pool expanded, the need for close relative marriage diminished. With the passage of time and the multiplication of people, the negative effects of inherited mutations began to appear. Generations of exposure to sin, disease, and environmental corruption took their toll on human DNA. As a result, what was once safe and necessary became increasingly dangerous. This brings us to a critical turning point in biblical history, the giving of the law through Moses. By the time we reach Leviticus 18, God introduces specific moral and biological laws for his chosen people. Among these laws is the prohibition of marriage between close relatives. These laws served multiple purposes. First, they protected the health of future generations by reducing the risk of congenital disabilities. Second, they established moral and societal boundaries that preserved the holiness and order of the Israelite community. It is important to see that God's commands are not arbitrary. They reflect his understanding of the changing conditions of the world and the needs of his people. In the beginning, when the human race needed to multiply from a single pair, sibling marriage was not only acceptable, but necessary. When humanity reached a point where such unions posed moral and biological dangers, God acted to forbid them. His laws are perfectly timed and tailored to each stage of human development. It was not a violation of any divine command. It was consistent with the plan God set in motion at creation. It fulfilled the purpose of populating the earth and was carried out during a time when genetic purity allowed such unions to take place without harm. This perspective helps to answer one of the most common criticisms raised against the Bible. Skeptics often point to Cain's wife as an inconsistency or contradiction. They claim that the Bible cannot be true if Cain had a wife when no one else was around. But when we consider the full biblical record, we see that the answer lies in understanding the progressive nature of revelation and the historical context of early humanity. The Bible does not list every child of Adam and Eve by name. Genesis 5:4 says that Adam had sons and daughters over a period of hundreds of years. These children would have formed the early human population, spreading across the earth and building the first communities. Cain's wife was one of them, and her marriage to Cain was in accordance with God's design at that time. Another reason God allowed these marriages early on was to emphasize his mercy and grace even after the fall. Sin had entered the world through Adam and Eve. Cain had murdered his brother, Abel. Yet God did not abandon humanity. He continued to provide the means for life, family, and community. The fact that Cain was able to have a wife and build a family even after committing such a terrible sin, shows that God's purpose for humanity could not be thwarted by evil. Cain's wife was part of that divine plan. Her presence affirms that God was still working, still guiding, still allowing life to flourish even outside the boundaries of Eden. Furthermore, this example teaches us an important principle about God's character. He is a God of order, not chaos. Everything he does is intentional. Even the things we may not fully understand, at first glance have deeper meaning when viewed through the lens of Scripture. God allowed Cain's marriage to a close relative because it was part of the orderly development of human society. It fulfilled a practical need and aligned with the purity of the early human condition. As we consider how laws and moral standards have shifted throughout Scripture, it's crucial to see that these changes are not inconsistencies but reflections of God's wisdom at work across time. Just as he allowed sibling marriage in the beginning and later forbade it for the sake of holiness and health, so too he gives commands that are appropriate for each era of history. This helps us to trust in his timing and his reasoning, even when we don't have every detail. In conclusion, Cain's marriage to his sister or niece was not an act of rebellion or sin. It was a step in the unfolding of God's creation mandate. It was made possible by the genetic purity of the first humans and was allowed during a time when humanity was just beginning to grow. God's later prohibition of such marriages under the law of Moses reflects the changing needs and conditions of a fallen world. What we see in this narrative is not a contradiction, but a demonstration of divine wisdom that adapts to the needs of humanity while always pointing back to his original purpose: to create, to bless, and to multiply. Cain's wife is not only a figure who resolves a question of human origin, but also a profound symbol of God's grace in the aftermath of sin. The story of Cain is marked by tragedy and consequences. He was the firstborn son of Adam and Eve, and the first murderer in human history. After killing his brother Abel out of jealousy and anger, Cain was confronted by God and faced divine judgment. God cursed him, saying that the ground would no longer yield fruit for him and that he would be a restless wanderer on the earth. But even in this moment of judgment, God showed mercy by placing a protective mark on Cain so that no one would kill him. It is within this context of sin, punishment, and mercy that the appearance of Cain's wife takes on deeper meaning. When Scripture says in Genesis 4:17 that Cain knew his wife and she conceived and bore Enoch, it signifies more than just a fact about human reproduction. It reveals that life continues even after rebellion. It shows that God's plans are not destroyed by human failure. Cain's wife becomes a symbol of continuation, of family, of legacy, despite the weight of guilt and exile. Her presence is not an accident or narrative gap. She is a key to understanding the persistent nature of God's mercy. After committing the most horrific crime known to that point, Cain was not erased from history. He was not destroyed. Instead, he was allowed to live, to build, and to form a lineage. His wife stood beside him in that process, unnamed but not unnoticed by God. She represents the silent grace that operates even when humans fall short. Cain's punishment was severe, but it was not the end. That in itself speaks volumes about the heart of God. The Lord could have chosen to remove Cain from the earth altogether, but he didn't. He chose to preserve his life and even allowed him the opportunity to become a father. This mercy is not something Cain earned, but something that flows from the character of God, and his wife's role in bearing a child is the evidence of that ongoing grace. Now, the birth of Enoch marks the beginning of cities and civilization. Cain built a city and named it after his son. This act of building symbolizes a return to order from chaos, a rebuilding of life after destruction. None of this would have been possible without Cain's wife. She was the vessel through which life would continue. In a very real way, she helped redeem a broken situation by participating in the forward motion of humanity. The fact that she is not named in the text may feel like an omission, but it also gives her a kind of universality. She could represent any one of us who, in quiet ways, help restore what has been broken. She reminds us that not all of God's work happens through people with loud voices and big titles. Some of the most important parts of God's plan are carried out by those whose names are never recorded, but whose lives are essential. Cain's wife is a reminder that God's grace is greater than our shame. It doesn't ignore sin, but it also doesn't cancel the future. After Cain sinned, God didn't restore him to the garden, but he did allow him to find companionship and to become a father. That's a profound message. It tells us that though consequences are real, they are not the final word. Grace doesn't erase justice, but it accompanies it. In the union between Cain and his wife, we see this tension resolved. Her presence is the quiet whisper of hope after the storm of violence. She is the continuation of life in a world that had already tasted death. Her ability to conceive and give birth is the signal that God is not done with humanity yet. There is still a story to be written. There is still a future to be lived. We often look for named heroes in the Bible, those whose identities are clearly stated and whose stories are expanded. But Cain's wife teaches us that you don't need a name to have a purpose. You don't need fame to be part of God's redemptive plan. She shows that being a part of what God is doing, even if unnoticed by history, is still a sacred role. She stood beside a broken man, bore the burden of his shame, and helped bring forth a new generation. That is not a small task. It's the essence of restoration. Her life also points to the fact that no matter how dark the moment, God always plants a seed of hope. Cain had killed his brother. Humanity had experienced its first murder. The ground had been cursed for Cain's sake. He was cast away. Yet the next verse tells us he had a wife and a child. That's the rhythm of God's work throughout all of Scripture. Sin brings death, but grace brings life. This unnamed woman carried within her the promise that humanity would not be lost. Her womb became the place where the future began again. She reminds us of how often God works through people who are not celebrated or even mentioned. In that way, she reflects the lives of countless faithful individuals who carry out the work of God behind the scenes. She models the silent strength that stands beside brokenness and brings forth new life. Her story is not just about biology or genealogy. It's about redemption. It's about how God takes the ashes of failure and creates something that can grow. It's about how grace can be present even when the consequences of sin still linger. Cain would live with his guilt. He would walk the earth as a marked man. But he would not walk alone. His wife walked with him. And together, they brought forth a child who would carry on the story. That's the beauty of God's mercy. It doesn't pretend the past didn't happen. It doesn't erase the pain. But it moves forward anyway. It continues to work. It continues to love. Cain's wife, though unnamed, is one of the earliest symbols of this kind of redemptive grace. Her presence tells us that no one is beyond the reach of God's mercy. Even in exile, even in shame, even after the worst sins, life continues. And in that continuation, there is always hope. Cain's story did not end with murder. It continued with marriage, with children, and with the building of a city. That continuation was made possible through his wife. Her role was not to undo what had been done, but to help forge a future that looked beyond the past. That's what grace does. It does not rewrite history, but it writes a new chapter. Her story encourages every person who feels forgotten, unnamed, or unworthy. It shows that God does not need our fame to use us. He needs only our availability. Her life tells us that even in a broken world, even beside a broken man, she became a vessel for God's purpose. Cain's wife, though hidden in the text, reveals a truth that echoes through all of Scripture. God is still working. Even in the aftermath of our greatest mistakes, He makes a way for grace to flourish and for life to begin again.